Well, welcome everybody. This is a rally for the Grizzly and a response to a proposed change that we'll go into detail about. And there's a number of organizations that made this possible. We've got the Sierra Club, Wyoming Wildlife Advocates, Wild Earth Guardians, and the Endangered Species Coalition. And just want to thank everybody for joining us. I know folks have a lot to do. And so the fact that you showed up today to learn about what's going on with the Grizzly and ways to advocate for it means a lot to me, but I know you're not here for me, you're here for the Grizzly, and it means a lot to Grizzly Defense as well. And so, agenda, I want to run through the agenda very quickly and then we'll do some introductions. I saw somebody ask me where I was in North Carolina, so I will tell you all that in a moment. But we'll do an introductions agenda. We'll go into what the proposed change does because this is pretty complicated. I have good news for y'all though. Lizzie is one of the best at explaining this stuff because when this first went live, we were like, what is this? Is this delisting? What does this do to Grizzly? How does this translate and impact ongoing recovery? And Lizzie's going to really make that digestible for each of you so you can go forward and tell your community what's happening with the grizzly bear. Then Kristen's going to talk about the impact of grizzlies and state management. She's got a great perspective and does so much for this animal as well. And then I'm going to talk to y'all a bit about the public comment period that opened up as a result of this proposed change, as well as some good old grassroots organizing that we can do to try to really push back and ensure that grizzly protections are strong and effective. And then we'll close out. So we're planning on this webinar lasting around an hour. We will have an opportunity for a Q&A there at the end. Feel free to put your questions in the chat ahead of time too. We'll try to get to them. But if not, please rephrase them at the end and we'll answer them. But first, and y'all kind of beat me to the punch, but want to know where you're calling in from? Go ahead and say hello. How did you hear about this? So did you see this online? Did you get an email? Which organization brought you here? And then the grizzly is so iconic and kind of a something you'll see in so many amazing wild American places. So what's your favorite wild place? Maybe a national park, maybe somewhere you like to go often to hike locally. But feel free to share that in the chat. And I'll also allow myself and my two co-hosts to introduce themselves. So I'll do the prompt, right? I'm calling in from Boone, North Carolina. I heard about this because I'm with the Endangered Species Coalition. My favorite wild place is probably here in my backyard, the Blue Ridge Parkway, and all the opportunities you get to really get outdoors and see wildlife there. And then in my role with the Endangered Species Coalition, I'm the national organizing director. And so I work on the organizing efforts for endangered critters across the nation. And I'll let Lizzie introduce herself.
Thanks, Dalton. My name's Lizzie. I'm calling in from Missoula, Montana. I heard about this when Dalton emailed me and said, "Hey, we're trying to do a webinar." So thanks for having me. My favorite wild place is like anywhere that I'm 100 feet under the ocean. I love scuba diving, and there's just nothing like the quiet of being underwater. And I work with Wild Earth Guardians. I am our carnivore coexistence attorney. I've been with them for 5 years. I primarily work on wolf and grizzly bear conservation. And we work all over the West. We protect and restore the wildlife, wild places, wild rivers, and health of the American West. So we are doing it all. And I'll pass it to Kristen.
Thanks, Dalton and Lizzie. I'm Kristen Combs. I'm the executive director at Wyoming Wildlife Advocates. We are based at the southern end of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem in Jackson, Wyoming. And we definitely inform and empower people to make changes to wildlife management in Wyoming and also really advocate for grizzlies, wolves, and elk, mostly just kind of focus on those three species as agents of change for different wildlife management regime changes that we're pushing for here in Wyoming to make things more biodiverse and to have more science involved in our wildlife management. And yeah, my favorite wild place is probably Grand Teton National Park. There's nothing like it. It's why I live here. It's rarely can you just go somewhere and like see, moose, elk, grizzly bears, black bears, badgers, coyotes, wolves. I mean, all in one day. It's a really incredible place. So I love wildlife and live close to it and feel very blessed to have that opportunity. So I will turn it back over to Dalton.
Yeah, well said, everybody, and love to see all the love for wild places in the chat. You guys have given me some new places to explore, so that was my motive in asking that question. And I'm going to toss it over to Lizzie, who's really going to talk about this proposal and try to help us understand what's going on with the grizzly right now.
Yes, thank you, Dalton. Let me just put my timer on so I don't talk forever. Okay, so I am going to talk about the proposal, the current proposal that just came out in July, but there is a lot of context here leading up to this proposal. So that's what I'm going to start with, just kind of lay the groundwork so that we are all on the same page and we can understand where this is coming from and why it is happening. So before 1800, grizzlies numbered 50,000. They were across 18 states in the West in the United States, from Canada to Mexico. And then as settlers moved west, they killed every predator in their path. And by the time grizzlies were listed in 1975, they were in 2% of their historic range, and there was less than an estimated 800 grizzly bears. So in 1975, just a few years after the Endangered Species Act was passed into law, grizzly bears were listed as a threatened species. A species can be listed as threatened or endangered. And threatened means a species is likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of its range. So grizzly bears are a threatened species. They still are. In the last 20 years, there have been several attempts at delisting that have failed in the courts, but that has not stopped politicians in the northern Rocky states, particularly Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, from doing everything they can to get grizzlies off of the endangered species list and be able to manage them at a state level, which Kristen will talk about why that would be a terrible thing. But those efforts by politicians in the Northern Rockies kind of culminated at the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022. Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming all separately petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to delist grizzly bears. So Montana said, delist the population around Glacier National Park. That is the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. Wyoming said, delist the grizzlies around Yellowstone National Park. That is the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And Idaho said, just delist them all. In response, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was like, Idaho, we think you made a bad argument. We're throwing this out. But Montana and Wyoming, you made some good points. What you're saying we should do may be warranted, which kicked into gear the 12-month process by which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decides should they be delisted or not, or what should happen to their listing status. So that's all happening. And then around that same time, there's a separate lawsuit brought by Save the Yellowstone Grizzly. I saw they are here. Hello. They challenged the agency killing of some grizzly bears in Idaho as being illegal against the Endangered Species Act regulations that are in place. The state of Idaho took that opportunity to challenge the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's denial of its delisting petition. So, like, hey, this lawsuit wouldn't be happening at all if you had just listened to us when we said grizzlies shouldn't be listed. So, there was a settlement in that case in which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agreed to either revise or revoke the grizzly bear listing by December 2026. So, that kicked off what we saw, the proposal in January 2025. And in that proposal, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said grizzly bears should still be listed as threatened, but they shrunk the area over which they are protected, which I think is the next slide, Dalton. Yes. So I will explain this in a second. And they proposed to change the 4D rule, which I will explain in much, probably more detail than any of you want. But that is the subject of the current proposal. So the one thing that the 2025 proposal did was say there should be new boundaries in which grizzly bears are protected. And the The grizzly bear entity that's listed in the lower 48 is called a distinct population segment. That's just an entity that can be listed under the Endangered Species Act, as well as a species or a subspecies. So it used to be the entire lower 48 was the grizzly bear distinct population segment, but in 2025, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said, let's shrink that to this area. There were some issues with this that we commented on last time around, but I think this is just good context to have when we talk about what has and hasn't changed with this proposal. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So that proposal was all outstanding, not outstanding, out space standing. In 2025, there were a few months of public comment. We had been waiting. We had been hearing rumors at the beginning of this year that we're going to see some sort of final rule, wondering what the Trump administration was going to do with a Biden administration grizzly bear proposal. Months later than we expected, the Trump administration came out with this new grizzly bear proposal at a very tragically hilarious press conference in a very windy area in Montana, as you can see pictured here. And what they said was, we are proposing new revisions to the grizzly bear 4D rule. Next slide. What does that mean? This is a legal term of art. This is not common knowledge. So what is a 4D rule? When a species is listed under the Endangered Species Act as endangered, there is a whole suite of protections that kick into place prohibiting take. So take is a pretty broad definition, but killing, harassing, harming, asterisks there, because the current administration is trying to say harming a species is not what the Endangered Species Act was trying to protect against, which is total garbage and is currently being litigated. But that is a whole nother webinar. So when a species is listed as threatened, it can get the same protections as an endangered species, but it doesn't have to. And that's where we get a species-specific 4D rule. And 4D is just the section of the Endangered Species Act that talks about exceptions to the take prohibition for listed species. So grizzly bears have always had their own species-specific 4D rule. And the legal standard here is that the rule and all the components of it must be, quote, necessary and advisable to provide for the conservation of a threatened species. In this proposal, and we see this a lot for predators, is, well, we're going to loosen up the take exceptions. We're going to allow more take because that will increase social tolerance, and therefore that contributes to the conservation of the species. There are loads of problems with this. It's not supported by scientific research. It's just a nice way to justify killing more bears to make the part of the population and the politicians who want to kill bears more happy. The current 4D rule, which is still in place because all of these changes since 2025 have just been proposed, nothing has been finalized, has limited take exceptions for self-defense, significant predation on livestock, or a demonstrable threat to human safety. Doesn't seem like that much, but there's still a lot of grizzly bear mortality under the current 4D rule. So a lot of us, I think, would say even the current rule is not good enough to get grizzlies to the place where they could finally be recovered. I mean, we went from 800 bears to just over 2,000 bears after 50 years of Endangered Species Act protections and dedicated funding and conservation efforts. And, we're told there's bears everywhere, but really there's not that many bears, and they're not, they're in 4 to 6% of their historic range, even with the current 4D rule. So what does this 4D rule do? So next slide. I'm going to first tell you the kind of management structure it sets up, and then how that management structure dictates what take exceptions apply or what protections apply or don't apply. So what this 4D rule does is create a tiered system. So an area could be in no tier, tier 1 or tier 2. So in an area that doesn't have a tier one or a tier two status, that means that a state or tribal grizzly bear management plan is not in place. Um, in a tier one area, this means that there is a state or tribal grizzly bear management plan in place, and there are conservation strategies in place. So a conservation strategy is a particular type of document that it's a formal document made by a mix of agencies that is applicable to a specific population of grizzly bears, like the grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem or the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, that basically lays out the guidelines for grizzly bear management that is supposed to keep that population at a sustainable level. So they're kind of designed for delisting. So if these conservation strategies would stay in place after delisting and keep grizzly bears at a place where they are recovered. Some issues with this are that there are a few conservation strategies in place right now. There is one for the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, and they are not perfect for grizzly bears. There have been a lot of issues with them and the things that they say grizzly bears need, and we've had a lot of pushback against them. So that's what a conservation strategy is. Total, just kind of aside to make sure we all know what that means. So tier one also means that whatever population we're talking about is not achieving demographic objectives. So the conservation strategy for a population would also say what are the demographic objectives for that population. So in tier one areas, those are not being met. In tier two areas, it's all the same, except those demographic objectives are being met. And this includes things like how many bears are there, but that's not all it is. It's how many female bears are there, how many female bears are having cubs, things like that. So it's a little more nuanced than just numbers. So two other things that this proposal does is once you have a tiered status, that happens in what is called an MOU. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a state or tribal agency authorized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service basically would sign an agreement that would say, we authorize you to have this tiered status. We approve of these plans. And then that MOU will detail, further take exceptions, which I'll talk about in a second. And then another question that's come up a lot is once an area has a tiered status, is that forever? Is there an automatic trigger that would revoke that tiered status? The answer is there is no automatic trigger. So for tier one areas, if things on the ground change so much that the population departs significantly from its potential to achieve those demographic objectives, then tiered status may be revoked. So even if the population, even if it's on an upward trajectory and it starts falling down from that, at what point does that depart significantly? That's vague. We don't know. And who's making that determination? The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I guess. And then even if that happens, they may revoke tiered status. So it's not a must. And that's important. And then for tier two, it can be revoked if those demographic objectives that were being met are no longer being met. So the population falls below whatever number is provided in the conservation strategy, or there's not enough females in the area, things like that. And then, again, it's may be revoked, not must be revoked, which is important. So next, this is just context for what are these ecosystems I'm talking about. So you can see the shaded area in the northwest corner of Wyoming. That is the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The closest one north of that, it's blue, is the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. Those have conservation strategies and there are state management plans in place. So we can speculate with some confidence that those would be tier two areas. And then those two smaller shaded areas west of the northern continental divide ecosystem are the Selkirk and the Cabinet Yaak ecosystems. They did not have conservation strategies, but about a week after this proposal came out, we also saw draft conservation strategies come out for those two ecosystems. So once those are finalized, those ecosystems would be eligible for tier one status. Those populations are not doing well. There are not very many bears there. And even the loss of one bear can take those populations off of the trajectory of working towards recovery. So they're definitely not meeting demographic objectives. So those would likely be tier one. And I'll talk about what would happen. Connectivity is a big thing and what happens in between ecosystems. I'll talk about that towards the end. Next slide. So, what does it mean if you're in no tier or tier one or tier two, right? This is all about take exceptions. So, if there is no tier assigned, then there's a couple buckets of take exceptions we're talking about, which is like agency killing, so bears involved in conflict and management removals. Um, Take that is incidental to lawful activities, which I'll explain a little bit more. And then another thing that this 4D does is allow individuals to deter bears with like hazing activities. So in a no tier area, the take exceptions for management activities or bears involved in conflict is similar to what it is now. Steps should be taken to avoid conflicts. Relocation must be tried. Um, and then take incidental to lawful trapping is allowed only in areas if there are no bears or bears are likely to be in their dens at certain times of the year. And take incidental to lawful trapping means, say, a wolf trapper, boo, goes out and sets a wolf trap that baits a grizzly, with bait in it, and a grizzly bear walks into that trap and gets its foot stuck in the trap. If a if the trapper followed the state laws governing trapping, that's lawful trapping, but that's still a grizzly bear take. So it's a take incidental to lawful trapping. Tier one is the same as no tier, except that more incidental take, where would it take incidental to lawful trapping be allowed, would be detailed in an MOU that talks about the tier. And then tier two is a nightmare. Tier two, all incidental take is authorized, incidental to any lawful activity, not just trapping, and take associated with management activities. So again, bears involved in conflict is just under the authority of the state or tribe that is in charge of that tiered area. And the specifics of what take is allowed would be detailed in an MOU. So those would happen after this rule is, if it is finalized. So we won't even see the details of what take will be allowed in tier two areas with this rule. And I will try to wrap up. I know I'm over my time. What didn't change here? They did not propose to change the listing status, so they're still in name threatened. The DPS proposal has not changed. And Dalton, you can click these. And the rule said they are considering separate final rules for these things. So we will see these at some point in the future before December. And then the last thing is key concerns. So I've already kind of talked about them, but one is the grizzly bears are not doing better, right? The threats to grizzly bears are getting worse, and mortality is already really high under current 4D rules, which are much more protective than what we have seen proposed. So a proposal that increases grizzly bears dying is not going to move grizzly bears towards recovery. The rule doesn't talk about connectivity areas or how increased killing in core populations will keep grizzly bears from dispersing between those populations, which in 2024, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said is absolutely necessary for grizzly bears to recover, is that they can naturally mingle between core populations, exchange genetics, that they can get over to the Bitterroot ecosystem in northern Idaho. We are going to see less of that if this passes. And then the last thing, which Kristen's going to talk about more, is tier two areas. We don't know what the take exceptions are going to be. It's super vague, and the details are being left to these contracts between the feds and authorized agencies, which means there's no analysis on the impacts of these, and it means we can't comment on them. So, with that, I will pass it to Kristen.
Thank you, Lizzie. That was really in depth, and I hope helps everybody get an idea of kind of what this specific thing entails. The proposal is very vaguely written, I will say that, and that's coming from Lizzie and other lawyers that have looked through it pretty extensively, and also from Dr. Chris Urbine, who was the grizzly bear recovery coordinator for decades for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Even he has said that this rule is really hard to understand and pretty big. So, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what exactly state management is going to look like because this tier two level that most bears, well, all bears within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and probably the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem will be under is going to basically fall back to it just being the state law will be applicable in those areas. And I put these two maps up here to kind of show you and remind everybody of, so we've got the brown area kind of at the bottom, well, it's my bottom right. I hope that's what you guys are seeing as well. Area of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This extends a little bit into Montana and Idaho, but the vast majority of it is in Wyoming. Then you've got the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, which is up near Glacier National Park. Then you've got these other areas. So the pink there on the map is the Bitterroot ecosystem, which that was an originally part of the original conservation strategy for grizzly bears. The original recovery plan called for bears to be in the Bitterroot and also in the purple and that other kind of brownish color up there. That is the Cabinet Yaak and the Selkirk ecosystems. And those were places where it was identified that bears needed to be present in order for us to have a recovered population. And then even also in that same conservation plan was that in the recovery plan was that bears should be in the Northern Cascades as well. And so we pretty much have no bears in the Northern Cascades in the Bitterroot and very, very few bears. We're talking like, lower than 50 in the Selkirk and Cabinet Yaak. And so we still have these really segregated island populations of grizzlies. And what this rule is going to do is going to make it so that any grizzly pretty much that's trying to make its way from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem into any of these other areas is they're just going to have basically zero chance of survival. We've already seen that with the Bitterroot. There have been bears that have tried to pioneer their way and get into the Bitterroot ecosystem, but over time, they either end up relocated or killed. And there's various things that end up killing bears that are, on the move. I mean, anything from car wrecks and getting hit by trains to actually getting killed by black bear hunters over bait. That happens pretty frequently in Idaho. And they're just, whether conflicts with people and getting removed by wildlife managers at the state level, all of those things are happening. And so I put this other map on there too to kind of show you the bigger picture here. This is a map that was put together by some research that actually shows areas where grizzly bears could inhabit across the western United States. And if you look at Wyoming there, you'll see the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is a small portion in the northwest corner of the state. And the rest of the state does have some grizzly bears that try to get out and about and have tried to leave the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This is for various reasons. One of the main being climate change is driving a lot of their food sources down, and we have invasive species here. So bears have to kind of search further for food. And what happens is any bear that does leave that area ends up usually dead, because of conflicts with people and removal by management officials. Cattle conflicts are often one of those things that we see as to why bears get killed. And so, under this tier two status, like any bear that's outside of that sort of green area that you see on the map there in Wyoming will pretty much cease to exist. And the state has not really been, they haven't minced words about not wanting grizzly bears outside of that area. Oftentimes they'll say that they're not socially suitable outside of those areas. And they're trying to claim that by more lethal control, that will somehow enhance people's tolerance of bears or social acceptance of bears. We've heard that from both Montana and Wyoming, and that's really just there's no evidence to back that up, and there's no way to really measure that either. I mean, if we compare it to wolves and how like we have a lot of lethal control around wolves in Wyoming, I don't think that there's any data out there to show that social tolerance for wolves has increased in the state. It's kind of remained the same. And so, yeah, another point I just wanted to make on this slide too is that we've heard this rhetoric out of well, from various officials, state officials, that, these bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. are the ones that are really managing bears in the West. And that just is 100% not true. Hillary Cooley and Dr. Chris Urbine, who was here for decades. I mean, all of these people, we have people here in Jackson, there's people up near the North Cascades that are on the ground every day working with people side by side, to help them prevent conflicts and to help live with bears. And so the fact that like, they're saying that there's some kind of like bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. managing bears is just totally inaccurate. So, next slide, Dalton. So yeah, I just want to kind of cover specifically about what is difficult about bears trying to survive in each state. So in Wyoming, in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we've had 74 bears killed that we know of, over the past 2 years in 2024 and 2025. This year, we're already up to over 30 bears that have been killed. So we're right on track to probably hit another high number. And a lot of, the narrative out of the state, they're saying, well, that's because there's more bears in more places. And so, of course, we're seeing more dead bears. But that doesn't take into account the fact that, like, we're not addressing the root cause of human bear conflicts. And we can do that whether bears are under state or federal control. Like, that is something that we should be doing regardless of who has control of bears in the state. And uh, there needs to be more efforts made to prevent conflicts and also like prepare people that maybe haven't had grizzly bears in their ecosystem for a while to be ready for grizzly bears to be around. I mean, we definitely have black bears across the state, and it's the same things that apply to black bears apply to grizzly bears with keeping them out of trash and making sure that your beehives are secure and chickens and things like that. There was a bill that was introduced in the legislature that would actually give everybody with an elk hunting tag, you would just get like a free license to kill a grizzly or a black bear with it as well. And so that was something that was introduced by the legislature. It did not make it through, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it again. And the legislature has also authorized our commission to conduct a grizzly hunt when it considers it like hunting beneficial for wildlife management or public safety. And so under this tier two status, there's not clear whether or not like hunting could be considered a management action. And in that respect, that's pretty scary to think about. Like right now, there's a proposal in Alberta where they're kind of piloting this project where hunters can come in and kill bears that are deemed to be like, in conflict with people. That just sets up a really bad precedent just across the board for just more liberalized killing of bears. Dalton, next slide. In Montana, now there is a state law that the legislature passed a couple years ago that basically just allows individuals with livestock to kill grizzly bears if they feel like their livestock is threatened, and it doesn't really describe or define what threatened means. It just sort of talks about that if you feel threatened. So, could somebody say, well, I saw a bear, so I felt threatened? potentially, and that would just lead to another bear ending up dead when it's not even doing anything. And the state has also prohibited the removal and relocation of bears to certain areas unless they are approved by the commission and or in the recovery zones. So, for instance, you could relocate a bear to the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, but you couldn't necessarily remove it to another area where, it may be they used to in the past. And this was kind of like poking their finger in the eye of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and saying, well, these are your bears, so you handle them and you deal with them. And once again, just all this leads to is more dead bears for sure. And next slide. One of the big things that this new proposed rule talks about is that the Selkirk and the Cabinet Yaak ecosystems are not considered really like in any way. And so that they would need their own separate conservation strategies. The executive committee of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee just met a couple weeks ago, and they talked about making a conservation strategy for these two areas. And that basically would either put them into the tier 2 status if they did have a conservation strategy eventually, or if they don't ever do that, then they can also say, well, bears in these areas are non-essential and experimental, and so we're just not even going to include them. If bears make it there, great. If they don't, no big deal. We don't need this as part of recovery. So that basically leaves an entire section of bears. And I don't know how many people here have been to central Idaho in the Bitterroot area either, but there's nothing but wild country out there. And if there was ever grizzly bear country in this in this nation, it is in central Idaho. And this is an area where repeatedly bears have tried to make it inroads in and have ended up dead because of humans. And so the state of Idaho has pretty much made it very clear they do not wish to have grizzlies in their state. And this is kind of just another concession to that of like, oh, well, we're just going to not think about the Selkirk and Cabinet Yaak ecosystems. And if we do eventually include them, they will just fall under this tier 2 status and be under state control as well. And as I mentioned before, bears are often killed. Grizzly bears are often killed over black bear bait in Idaho as well. So next slide. In summary, kind of why is this a bad idea to have states have more control? Which, just to get it clear, like the states have pretty much always had control. There's never been an instance that anyone is really aware of where the state said, hey, we really need to kill this bear for the reason A, B, and C, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services said no. So the fact of the matter is that the states have the ability to kill bears right now under the current rule as it is. That's kind of what Lizzie was talking about earlier. Like even the current rule is really not that great at protecting bears. And so, this plan, and if these MOUs get approved, they're only as good and durable as the legislature is right now. And we know that the legislatures in all three of these states have been very anti-predator and have been leaning toward really, being very harsh on predators and large carnivores. And so all it would take is 1 year of a legislature to be in service, and the laws could change drastically. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it does talk about how they could revoke the status here, but it doesn't say like that they should if this happens or that happens. If state law changes, it could take a while before that gets, this MOU gets changed or whatever to make it so that bears aren't dying again. Like I said, states have already been managing grizzlies and they've had U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service oversight. So at least there's been some kind of check and balance. This will remove that. States already have the ability to manage bears however they want outside of these core areas pretty much. And that's only going to get more lenient, and there's going to be definitely more lethal control that we will see there. And we don't know what kind of level of mortality or action would rise to the level where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would be like, yep, we're going to yank your tiered status. I can see that being a very tough, hurdle to kind of climb over. And as Lizzie said earlier, all that incidental take is accepted and exempt under this tier 2 status as well, which is where most bears will fall into in both Montana and Wyoming. So state management overall is undoubtedly going to lead to more dead bears, and it's going to take the decisions, a lot of them, out of the hands of people that the wildlife managers that are on the ground, and put them more into the hands of politicians, which usually, as we all know, doesn't end up very favorably for the wildlife. So with that, I will turn it over to Dalton, who's going to tell us a little bit about what you can do. And I've seen a lot of comments on here. I know everybody's really upset, and I would say just take that energy and funnel it into some action, because there are things that you can do.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was about to say, I see a lot of passion in the chat, and this is the part where we tell y'all what you can do to really show up for the Grizzly and push back on some of this. I also just want to thank both of y'all because this has been a very complicated proposal and change. And if you were sitting in this and you thought, man, this is super complicated, lawyers and scientists feel the same way, right? And that's how rushed and pushed out this was, without really including the scientific community, the conservation community, and so much more. And so there is a public comment period that has opened related to this proposed rule change. And it's due August 17th. So we don't have a long time, y'all. But public comments matter. I know right now, everybody, you probably feel like nothing I say to the federal government will change their mind, right? They're not going to listen to me. I'm just one person. But we've seen many of these administrative changes, these proposals, really get stopped in their tracks because of this unignorable public outcry, right? And public comment coming in, people calling their elected officials, really kind of teeing up the pressure. And so I just want to say they absolutely do matter. It doesn't take a lot of work to make a public comment through the Federal Register. That's also the good news. And all these comments are in the public record. So it's out there. They can't say Lizzie didn't come to us with concerns. They can't say Kristen didn't come to us with these concerns. They are public record, right? And this is how we hold our government accountable. Again, just because you think they won't listen to you, don't make the excuse for these folks, right? And don't and not put that pressure on them, right? Um, and then also, very interestingly, this was flagged as we were preparing for this. There's this kind of caveat with public comment that, Lizzie, I think you kind of characterized as somewhat unique, right? Is that, yeah, a little bit of a head nod there. And here's our friend Doug Burgum. I say friend, a little tongue in cheek here, saying, right, please note submissions merely stating support for or opposition to the action under consideration without providing supporting information, although noted, do not provide substantial information necessary to support a change from the proposed rule. Basically, this is saying if you don't cite sources and you just say, I support the Grizzly and I don't like this change, they're telling you they're not going to take that into account. So you might be thinking, right? Oh my gosh, I'm not a scientist. What do I need to quote to make an effective public comment? Well, we have a toolkit that we're going to send everybody once this webinar wraps up. You'll get it tomorrow, that provides studies that you can cite as a part of your public comment. There's some examples of that. And so you will have that in your inbox that you can use. And so as you're crafting an effective comment, recognizing kind of the barriers that have been put in place, here's just a couple of tips that I feel like will help, right? You want to be clear and direct. So lead with that opposition, right? Kristen would say, my name is Kristen Combs. I'm in Wyoming and I oppose this rule change, and then cite those sources. But you want to start strong and make it very clear from the start that you are opposed. Personal, right? You want to kind of show that you are somebody that cares. You want to show the impact and include evidence. Again, those materials will be found in the toolkit. And then mobilize others. So we don't have long, right? August 17th isn't that far away, but I bet most of y'all will be able to make this comment tonight, right? It won't take a lot of time. You'll have this toolkit. You'll be able to look at it and prepare it. But that gives you time to encourage family members, friends, folks in your community, those wildlife groups that you're a part of, all of these different organizations, to tell these folks, hey, this is going on right now. We don't have long, and this is going to have an impact. And then, right, share your public comment with lawmakers. So you've got people in Congress that represent you, and this is a great opportunity to tell them, I support the grizzly bear and the tools that help it recover and keep a stable population. I also support empowering the Endangered Species Act. I don't support this rule change. I think it's very important to let you know, as my representative, that I have a lot of concerns about this. And there's kind of that example script there on the right, right? That tailor that to yourself. But this is a really good opportunity to put some pressure on your Congress people. Again, find others to give public comment. One of the great things about public record is you know who made public comment. So if you have a friend that said, promises you, Lizzie, I promise I'm to put in that public comment, you can actually find out if they did or not and say, hey, you need to get on it. And then educate your community. So we all know people in our communities that care about wildlife. We saw the passion in the chat here, and make sure that people know that this is going on. This is the road to delisting. Just because it doesn't use the word delisting doesn't mean that this doesn't have a similar impact and lead us there. And so, being very vocal, mobilizing your community, making noise about it, is the way to really stop this mess in its tracks, right? Stop it before it gets to that delisting path, and ensure that more grizzlies aren't harmed, right? And this population can recover. And then here's the toolkit. And I'm going to ask Lizzie or Kristen to put it in the chat for everybody just so y'all can have it now. Again, Zoom will send you a closeout email tomorrow, but I encourage you to, if you can, if you're able to grab this link and bookmark it or, save it or whatever you have to do. And this kind of gives you a version of what we've talked about tonight. You can see the top line message here. And here's those talking points we were talking about that cite those studies. And this is, again, really key to emphasize in your public comment, especially recognizing that they said they expect you to have these studies for it to be, I don't want to say counted, but impactful in their evaluation. And then there's also a link to the register right here. So directly on the Federal Register, or you can use Bears Belong, which Kristen and Lizzie, I think both are a part of. And now I know we've had a number of hands, a lot of questions in the chat. So encourage everybody to throw questions in the chat. Try to use everyone if you can and not hosts and panelists so everybody can see it. Um, Let's see. One of the ones is, does opposition from someone who lives in another state carry any weight? Well, you might notice I'm a North Carolinian and I'm on this Grizzly webinar, so it absolutely does. And one of the things too, for these folks that work on Grizzlies all the time, we need lawmakers in Congress coming out in support of the Grizzly anywhere, right? So just because they're in North Carolina or the Northeast or whatever, we need all the supporters that we can get. And so call your congressperson, make that public comment, cite those studies. It absolutely will carry some weight. Um, Kate said hers did not include any scientific studies. I'm pretty sure you could make another comment. Isn't that right, Lizzie and Kristen? You could probably go back and make another one.
Yeah, I think so. I think you can follow up and and cite those studies. And in our action alert, we said, citing the studies isn't enough for what we put in the toolkit, because we put all those studies into the administrative record. So you can just say these studies have been submitted to the record by Wild Earth Guardians and Wyoming wildlife advocates. Um, yeah.
See anything else?
I did just want to mention that, yeah, it doesn't matter where you're from. I mean, grizzlies that are across the Northern Rockies are on a lot of public land, and that's land that all of us own. And no matter where you are in the country is really important to have these animals. I mean, this is the last strongholds of places where these animals can actually survive in the United States. And so please, please continue to reach out to your congresspeople and let them know how you feel about this. As we saw with attacks on the Endangered Species Act, there have been a lot of really good champions all across the political spectrum, from outside of places that, you normally think of as like having a lot of endangered species. So please, please, please continue to speak up no matter where you are from.
And Lizzie put it, I missed this in the chat. I'm trying to see other questions. She said, your comment matters even if you do not live in Grizzly country. Grizzlies are a national treasure. So well put. We have one question in the Q&A is about the role of bears in ecosystems in the proposal, and the understanding that wild animals have no concept of state borders. I think Kristen, really said this well, but this is why it's so important that we ensure that management doesn't go to the states, right? Because grizzlies don't know which state they're in, and all of these kind of puzzle piece plans aren't going to be effective. And so I don't know if you want to answer that. Any more than that, Kristen, but I think that just speaks so much to what your point was.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% not wrong. Like these bears are really important to ecosystems. I think we see that, especially in Wyoming. If you look at across the state where we don't have large carnivores present, grizzly bears and wolves are missing from a lot of the state. Even mountain lions are not really that well represented across the state. And we do have a decent black bear population, but as far as like, some of these coursing predators go, we just don't have them. And we have some incredibly sick elk and deer because of that. And so you are correct that ecosystems are suffering by not having these animals there. However, when it comes down to making comments that are particularly important to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, sometimes we have to like stay focused on the policy that they're representing. And we have asked them many times to look at these conservation strategies and the recovery plans. I mean, these things, some of them haven't been updated in years, and we know a lot more now than we did back when they were made. And so we are pushing them also to make updates to these plans, and that's really where you get into the nitty-gritty, down in deep science around why it's important that, we have large enough areas for grizzly bears to be in and things like that. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's just a matter of like applying the right information at the right time.
I'll also note there's been a couple of questions in the chat about some pieces of the presentation or about the recording. We will also send out that recording to you as well tomorrow once the Zoom recap is able to go out. So if you missed something, you can go back to it and we'll have that uploaded to YouTube hopefully by then. So you can also share this presentation with anybody in your life that you think needs to know about what's going on with the grizzly. Looking at a few more questions.
I
Of course,
saw one about legal action, which I can address really quickly. If so, this is a proposal. It has to get finalized, but you can bet that this will be in court.
awesome, everybody. And I know we'll have a closing real quick, but I just want to allow for one or two more questions. Colleen
Um,
asked a great one I would love both of y'all's perspective on, which is what can we do as individuals to change policies for grizzlies and other animals given the current administration?
Don't give up. It's so hard. There's so many things happening at the same time. But that's a tactic. And, on some of our most difficult wildlife issues, sometimes the best we can do is hold the line, and it is important. And we have to do that. We have to, even when we are so different than the current administration, which is, anti-wildlife and we are pro-wildlife. When we speak up, and especially when we speak up in mass, because we represent most people are pro-wildlife, we swing the conversation that way. And we make the anti-wildlife side, we make it very clear to them and the public that they are not representing the public. And if we go silent, um, then people might think that that is what the public wants is anti-wildlife, or that those views are the majority when they're not. So even when it feels like we are yelling into the void and banging our head against a brick wall, which I empathize with so much, we have to keep doing it and we have to keep speaking up and we have to keep talking to each other about it and educating people. And even in Montana, I just had an event where people here are pretty knowledgeable, I would think, about grizzlies and wolves. And I had like a little trivia thing, and it was like, how many grizzlies did there used to be? People had no idea. So when people hear there's 2,000 grizzlies, they're like, wow, that's so many grizzlies. But if you put it in context, it's not. And so I think getting the right information out there in a world of misinformation and straight up lies is something we cannot stop doing, even when it doesn't feel like we're making a difference. I genuinely believe that we still are.
And to add to that, this past Earth Day, there was a bill that was about to be introduced that would dismantle the Endangered Species Act. And the organizations you saw here today, right? So many of the people that are here, we showed up. We called our Congress people. There were people there in DC at the time. And we were outspent. It's not that we had the most money. It's not that, it was just people power. To Lizzie's point, I mean, communities voiced that they cared. And they called legislators that we never in a million years would have thought would have sided with us, right? I mean, so many people were looking at this and thought, this is a done deal. The Endangered Species Act is going to be attacked. This is going to pass the House. And we won because we made that noise and that sustained pressure. And I've always say this, right? Organized people beats organized money every day, right? But that's the only way you're ever going to beat these kind of big forces that are against it. And so don't get discouraged. And I think Cecilia had said something in the chat that I love too, right? Public lands. We won on public lands as a country because we made enough noise. And that's really what it takes. And it wasn't just a single person calling. It wasn't just a single person making a public comment. It was individuals going to the people they know, going to their community and saying, we all need to get together and push back against this. And that's exactly what we need to do here.
I would like to just mention one other thing is that, something that kind of outside of the policy realm of things, if you're in an area where there are bears, helping like on the ground efforts to help mitigate conflicts or prevent conflicts with people goes such a long way to helping just like that it just sort of removes the issue of like, bears being that's considered like a nuisance or whatever. It more puts it into the realm of like, okay, here's what we people did to help prevent this from happening. And now like we don't have to worry about bears being, in our garbage or in our chickens or anymore. So, helping people, whether it's working with local organizations that are helping people to electrify fences or getting bear resistant trash cans in areas, like those are things that you can absolutely do wherever you are. And I know across the country, like black bears are pretty widespread and they're just as important to protect also. So yeah, by any means, also just look for ways like in your own communities that you can help and or just inform other people. Because a lot of people just don't know what's going on, and this is pretty complex stuff, and so it can easily go under the radar if people don't understand it.
Well, and I wanted the closing to end with basically this message of we can do this, and the question teed it up perfectly. And so I just want to thank both Lizzie and Kristen for being here today. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy day to be here on behalf of the Grizzly. It has a huge impact, and keep an eye out in your email inbox for all the information, the toolkit we'll send out, as well as that recording. And go forth, y'all, and let's show up and fight for the Grizzly and wildlife. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for attending.